Recently, I was sent an article by a friend with the eye-catching and, dare I say, provocative title, "What Happens When Priests Get High?" The article, having appeared in the New Yorker some 6 months ago, reported the findings of a study undertaken a decade earlier, in which troubled religious leaders from a diverse array of religious institutions were invited to take the psychedelic psilocybin in order to test how effective psychedelically induced religious experiences could be in rejuvenating participants' sense of spiritual well-being. The article not only reported the outcomes of the study, predictably expressing a general yet not incautious optimism about psychedelics' potential for increasing people's quality of life past spiritual. It also interviewed many of the participants, taking particular interest in those who reported that psilocybin generated for them a life-changing religious experience. Of the admittedly small self-selecting sample size, 30 religious leaders from similar demographics, the article stated that 79% had reported that psychedelically induced religious experience had enriched subsequent experiences of prayer. It also enriched how they experienced their vocation, as well as their awareness of the sacred in everyday life. Over the 2 sessions of taking the drug, 96% insisted that their first encounters with psilocybin had generated one of their top 5 most spiritually significant experiences. And those experiences were variously described as an intense, immediate encounter with God, or for the 4% for whom the experience was negative, as an encounter with the abyss. The positive accounts with the divine were in some instances described as being maternal, in other instances as being erotic, and in one instance as being a total deconstruction of patriarchal religion. With these presumably desirable outcomes, one of the principal researchers and an avowed enthusiast for psychedelic medicine described psilocybin as game-changing for the phenomenon of religion, having the potential to inject new life into those religious institutions and their teachings that contemporarily appear to be suffering from waning popular interest. The unmediated and intense experience of the sacred, which for centuries has been the special province of mystics, can potentially be made available to all and sundry. One way to look at psychedelics, stated the researcher, is as revelation happening in the present. Whatever your initial impressions of the methodology and morals of the study, one thing it surely brings into sharp relief is that despite our contemporary inclinations towards a materialist metaphysic, the desire for the mystery and otherness of the sacred has not gone away. Or rather than simply conceding a desire for the sacred, the study and the accounts of its participants betray an underlying yearning for the sacred to intrude once again into the mundanity of our lives. We want God to speak to us. We want him to make his being known and felt. Contrary to the logic of a purely materialist metaphysic, this ingrained thirst is not for nothing. It cannot be easily explained away as a byproduct of the evolutionary process. It bears witness to the fact that we were made for communion with God in all his mystery. reducible to a desire for propositional knowledge of God as an impersonal principle. Rather, it is a thirst for knowledge of a someone who is paradoxically infinitely transcendent so as to be beyond being itself, but infinitely close, such that he places longing for him at the centre of human identity. The fullest knowledge of a someone, and especially a knowledge of the ultimate someone, cannot be distilled into a knowledge of an it. Instead, it must engage the totality of who we are. And so far as we innately desire God to make himself known to us, we desire that the mystery of all who he is captivates the totality of all who we are as individual persons, the entirety of our hearts, imaginations and wills. We desire this captivation to be an authentic union, a communion, where God, in the freedom of who he is, chooses to give himself and make himself known. Like any authentic relationship, this self-revelation cannot be contrived or forced. The self-revelation that underscores communion with the divine is only authentic insofar as it begins and is guided by freedom. This self-revelation of God is first freely made with the act of creation. It is first in the sense of being the starting point in God's communication to us of who he is. The heavens are telling of the glory of the Lord, the glory of God, the psalmist sings, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, there are no words, their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth. The great paradox of what we would hear contemporarily described as a religious experience is that it arises from the communication of a voiceless entity. The full expanse of the sky, the sun, the stars, and the outer expanse of the space are, on their own, eerily silent and impersonal. Yet their silence and impersonality are broken only when the eyes of faith see in the vastness and grandeur of the firmament the reflection of the Creator's own infinite grandeur. Or rather, to think of it as another side of the one coin. The silence and impersonality are broken when the greatness of the firmament is perceived as God revealing something of who he is. For the psalmist then, the created order is in itself a persistent invitation on the part of God to those who have eyes to see, bidding them to search for him, to know and feel his unceasing presence, and through the mediation of his handiwork, to commune with him. Revelation under this description, then, can only be authentically experienced when it is known to be a free, universally available, yet nonetheless personal gift from God. Sometimes the knowledge of this invitation will move you. Other times it might not. But the reality of this revelation does not depend on emotions generated, helpful though they might sometimes be. Since the experience of revelation is grounded in the mutual self-giving between persons, its purpose and persistence will transcend the ebb and flow of the emotional life. If he truly does want his creatures to commune with him, if he truly has fashioned the human heart such that it thirsts for this communion, then God will not reveal himself in a whack-a-mole fashion. Although he shrouds himself in mystery and quiet, he will not present himself as a protein shapeshifter. We should expect the experience of revelation then to be in some sense stable. It is stable not in the way that undercuts the divine mystery, hiddenness and quiet, but rather in the sense of being an ever-present invitation to seek God out as an eternal presence, an invitation that requires us to use our minds as part of the totality of our whole person. A communion of persons, as I said, is always grounded in freedom, demanding thereby that God will not require us to jettison our rational faculty in order to come to know something of him. And because then communion with him engages our rational faculty, the revelation of who God is should flow into an understanding of his intention for those whom he has made for himself. The law of the Lord is perfect and fulfilling, the psalmist sings. It revives the soul. The decrees of the Lord are stable, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, making the heart rejoice. Far from being simply a momentary sense of elation, the authentic experience of God's self-revelation will lead the human soul correspondingly into a deeper self-understanding. It is a self-understanding, however, that is not accessed through altered mind states, but rather through the cultivation of a humble, teachable, and contemplative heart. That is why the psalmist can express a wonder at the law of the Lord, those reasonable yet revealed precepts that lead the soul into an excellence and wisdom that it could not achieve by its own lights. The experience of God's self-revelation on this score should lead one to be, and be with an ever-expanding excellence, the person whom their divine Creator designed them to be. Perhaps one might respond that these hallmarks of the experience of God's self-revelation sound a little bit like the positive outcomes described in the study of the psychedelically induced religious experience. Greater sense of job satisfaction for previously troubled religious leaders, a greater sense of prayerfulness, a greater sense of the sacred. How can the original experience that fosters these results be anything but genuine, and the means for generating that experience be anything but good? How can psilocybin not be a gateway to genuine divine revelation? I cannot step directly into the shoes of those participants, and nor do I think it helpful to question the sincerity of those who reported positive outcomes. I can say, however, that the notion of taking a pill and suspending our rational faculties runs counter to the logic of personal communion, which is at the heart of authentic divine revelation. Just as the fullest expression of our personhood is necessarily marked by freedom, so too is God entirely and infinitely free. His self-communication to his rational creatures always begins with his freely initiated invitation, the first being that universally available invitation to discover him in the goodness of his creation. Since the acceptance of this invitation requires the totality of one's mind, heart, and will, it seems odd that God would reserve the truest and most intense experiences of union with him to instances where we must set aside the most foundational part of who we are. It seems odd that he should set aside the quiet ways in which he communicates himself to the soul habituated in contemplation, so as to contain the experience of his self-revelation in the effortless popping of a pill. It seems odd that we should be the masters of when we see him. Whatever the psilocybin episode generated in those participants, it is difficult to see how it comes anywhere near the truth of divine revelation. For it misses the reality that we were made for genuine communion with God, not just an impression of communion at which we grasp. It misses the core reality that the initiator of this communion, and so too of authentic divine revelation, can only ever be God himself. Why then would we miss the real experience?